Hello and welcome to the Monday Call. I'm James Grigger, Chief Investment Officer at NZ Funds. It is Monday, 28th March at 9 a.m. Putin's invasion of Ukraine does reflect a sense of a threat in the Kremlin, but it is a threat relating to the political survival of his authoritarian regime rather than the national security of Russia as he claims. So what does this mean? What's going on at the moment? And what developments are we seeing on the ground? To help us make sense of Putin's motivations and how the war could play out, we're joined by Professor Robert Patman, one of New Zealand's preeminent international relations experts. Robert Patman is one of the University of Otago's inaugural sesquicentennial distinguished chairs and a specialist in international relations. He has previously served as editor for the journal International Studies Perspectives and as head of Department of Politics at the University of Otago. His research interests include global security, US foreign policy, great powers, and the Horn of Africa. He has edited or authored 13 books. Robert is also an honorary professor of the New Zealand Defence Command and Staff College and makes regular contributions to the national and global media on international relations. Professor Patman, it's an absolute privilege to have you on the Monday Call this morning.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure.
And look, there's, like I said in the intro, there's so much to cover and so many things we could discuss. But we did talk about when we caught up late last week around perhaps setting the scene for what's actually going on and the causes of the invasion of Ukraine. And that might help us, mere novices, get a better understanding of what's going on. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you. But before we start, I just wanted to say to everyone on this webinar this morning that please feel free to send questions through the Q&A on Zoom. I will field them, and you know it's not many opportunities we get to ask people like Professor Patman questions, so do fire them through. On that note, Professor Patman, the floor is yours, and really looking forward to your comments and views.
Thanks very much, James. As James indicated, I will spend about the next 10 minutes just giving an overview of why Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, opted for a full-scale invasion on the 4th of February of this year, 24th of February of this year, having denied he would invade the country. President Putin's decision to launch what he called a special military operation against Ukraine appears to be the greatest use of force by one state against another state at any time in the post-1945 period in Europe. So it's a significant development. The decision came shortly after Mr. Putin had announced his recognition of the independence of Moscow-backed separatist groups in eastern Ukraine, and he indicated he would send what he called a peacekeeping mission to support the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, as he called them. These are predominantly Russian-speaking areas in eastern Ukraine, which the Russians had helped establish in 2014, but more about that in a minute. So why has the Russian president significantly escalated military actions against neighboring Ukraine? What could justify the deployment of large numbers of Russian troops to Ukraine? What could justify missile strikes against major Ukrainian cities, and particularly on civilians? More than close to 1,000 Ukrainian civilians have died. And of course, the missile attacks and the shelling attacks have included Kyiv, the country's capital. The contemporary conflict between Russia and Ukraine actually erupted in March 2014. And war has been going on between Russia and Ukraine for 8 years now, and 14,000 people had already died before the escalation that we're now witnessing. In March 2014, Putin's Russia annexed Crimea, and that was the first time that interstate borders in Europe had been changed by force since 1945. That is to say, that's the first time since 1945 that one state has changed the borders of another state using military force. It then, shortly after annexing Crimea, intervened in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine to support, help first of all establish, but also support armed separatists, which are basically proxy groups representing Russian interests. In recent months, the conflict has entered a dangerous new phase. US and NATO spy satellites, as well as independent commercial satellites such as Maxar, have detected the build-up of something like, estimates vary, but somewhere between 150, 190,000 Russian troops on the border of Ukraine. It wasn't just a military build-up of troops, but it was also accompanied by air defense formations, artillery, and logistics on Ukraine's borders with Russia and Belarus. At the same time, vital enablers for a large-scale military operation have been put in place. Things like field hospitals and engineering units were systematically put in place before the 24th of February. And this is why President Biden began to warn with some urgency that he believed Russia was on the point of invading Ukraine. And these warnings became quite vocal and quite insistent. Meanwhile, the Putin regime had reiterated a familiar argument in the build-up to the full-scale invasion that we just witnessed. NATO enlargement in East Europe during the post-Cold War period. 14 countries in Eastern Europe have joined NATO in the post-Cold War period, the period since the late 1980s, 1989 onwards. During this post-Cold War period, as I said, 14 countries have joined NATO, and the Putin regime has often said that this was a grave security threat to Moscow, this build-up of NATO in Eastern Europe, and it has said that really NATO aggression, as Moscow put it, was at the heart of the Ukrainian problem. It was particularly concerned about Ukraine's links with the Western world. With this in mind, Mr. Putin put his cards on the table in January, and in fact December last year and January this year, about what he wanted to avert war. He demanded that NATO membership for Ukraine must be permanently ruled out. So NATO must not, a democratic country, an independent sovereign country, was being told that it can never exercise sovereignty when it comes to security choices. So he was basically demanding the right to veto Ukraine's security choices. And in addition, he made the demand that NATO must pull back from its involvement from Eastern Europe, effectively go back to 1997. So what he was effectively demanding was the countries of Eastern Europe should lose their NATO status. And he indicated, unless these demands were met diplomatically, the Putin regime would, as it put it, take military technical means to resolve what it saw as a core security threat emanating from Ukraine. So to summarize, Mr. Putin was arguing that Ukraine's links with the Western world and perhaps links with NATO were a key security concern for the Putin government. Now, these demands were predictably rejected by the Biden administration and its allies. There is little evidence to support, when I say predictably rejected, let me explain that. There is little evidence to support Mr. Putin's narrative that the United States has been the driving force behind NATO's enlargement in Eastern and Central Europe in the post-Cold War period. This is a crucial point that is often missed in much media commentary. Washington was not the driving force behind NATO enlargement in Eastern Europe. The real impetus for NATO's expansion in Eastern Europe has come from the countries of the region themselves. Many of these countries were determined to protect themselves against the possibility of any renewed Russian attempt to establish a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe during the post-Cold War period. Why were Eastern European countries, after the Cold War was over, so sensitive to the possibility of renewed Russian involvement in their affairs? Well, firstly, during the Cold War, and memories linger, many countries such as Hungary, Poland, what was then called Czechoslovakia, all experienced Russian intervention, or Soviet intervention as it then was, Soviet Russia. And in the early 90s, although the Cold War was over, it was for many of these countries not possible to completely turn the page. Why? Because in 1993, the Russian parliament, Russia was Russia was the legal heir to the Soviet Union. Russia's parliament, the Duma, was stormed by forces seeking to overthrow the democratically elected Yeltsin government and also re-established the Soviet Union. And from the point of view of Eastern European countries, this was a gravely worrying development, because it seemed that if there were forces that could take power in Moscow that wanted to recreate the Soviet Union, then those forces, that those political decision makers, would probably want to re-establish a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Now, we've seen that there were a number of diplomatic attempts, quite energetic diplomatic attempts involving the Biden administration, Germany, France and the UK to try to bridge the gulf between with the Putin government over its concerns in Ukraine. An interesting factor here is that Mr. Putin has not sought resolution of the Ukrainian problem by dealing with the Zelensky government. It believes the solution to the problem is through Washington. So this tells us quite a lot about Mr. Putin's perceptions of international relations. He basically has a 19th century view, in my opinion, where great powers run the world. And therefore, if there's a problem like Ukraine, from Mr. Putin's point of view, then you need to get a diplomatic solution, ideally, through working with a superpower and try to persuade them of the legitimacy of your case. Now, that clearly has not worked. Mr. Macron, in particular, made marathon efforts. He spent 5 hours in Moscow and numerous phone calls with Mr. Putin, and Mr. Putin promised him just 2 days, I think, or 3 days before the full-scale invasion occurred, that he would not invade the country. So I think there's a growing sense in Washington and elsewhere that Putin has not been really seriously interested in a diplomatic solution. The crucial difference hinges on the fact that Mr. Putin refuses to accept, and this is probably why he hasn't dealt with Zelensky, he refuses to accept that Ukraine is a legitimate sovereign state. In a recent televised address, which stretched on for 65 hours 2 days before the invasion, the Russian leader told Russian state TV that the Ukraine never had, quote, real statehood, and he went on to claim that the country was an integral part of Russia's own history, culture and spiritual space. In short, in Mr. Putin's view, Ukraine was nothing but a Russian creation, and therefore, in Mr. Putin's view, the special military operation was not an invasion or an annexation. It was simply reclaiming what rightfully belonged to Russia. Putin's hardening stance towards the Ukraine is linked to the 2013 Euromaidan protests, which toppled the then pro-Russian leader Viktor Yanukovych, and thereafter saw democratic governments in Kiev deepen their ties with the EU and the West generally. This trend could be seen as a major political threat to the survival of Mr. Putin's authoritarian regime in Russia. Let me just backtrack on this for a moment. Despite annexing Crimea and also beginning a military an insurgency in eastern Ukraine in 2014, that action tended to spur Ukraine's links with the West. And actually, interestingly, NATO began to loom much more in the language of Ukrainian governments after 2014. Why? Because they felt threatened by the Putin government, particularly after having territory illegally seized from them. And so NATO, in a sense, became an issue where it wasn't really an issue before 2014. Let me just say why Mr. Putin, this conflict is not just about the Ukraine. And we need to say something about Mr. Putin's attitude towards the West. It should not be forgotten that since Mr. Putin returned to power as president in 2012, he's now been in power for 22 years, either as president or as prime minister. But he had a period when he was prime minister between 2008, 2012, and he returned to the presidency in 2012 from Mr. Medvedev. He took over from Mr. Medvedev. One thing that's striking is since 2011, 2012, Mr. Putin's hostility towards the Western world has hardened. He's taken steps to deepen the conservative orientation of his authoritarian regime at home. He's placed, for example, very tight restrictions on all NGOs, non-governmental organisations, particularly foreign ones. He's taken measures against what he calls gay propaganda. He's made it very difficult for people to have, if you like, sexual freedom. He's also put very tight limits in place on political rallies, and he has severely circumscribed media freedoms. And those media freedoms have been even more circumscribed since the full-scale invasion has occurred. So what we've seen since 2012 is Mr. Putin increasing a hostile approach to the EU and NATO, but also developing and presenting his regime as an international champion of far-right causes. For example, the Putin government was supporting Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD in Germany, which is a neo-Nazi group. It has also had very good relations with Steve Bannon. It has also championed Brexit and national populism in the UK. And as we know, it was very sweet, very well-disposed towards Mr. Trump. So, in short, and we've seen this played out during this crisis, the Putin regime has deepened its hostility to what might be described as the rules-based, the liberal order, but it's presented itself and made overtures to far-right nationalist populist groups. So this was quite a significant change. At the same time, while Putin's political circle and friendly oligarchs have amassed enormous political and financial power, the Russian economy has remained quite sluggish. It should be pointed out that even before this crisis, before a comprehensive package of sanctions were extended, Russia's economy was only about the 11th biggest in the world. That is slightly smaller than Italy's. Russia's often described as a great power. It certainly wants to be seen as a great power, but in economic terms, it doesn't qualify. It's not in the same league as the United States or China. It should also be pointed out that while Mr. Putin and his relatively small circle of supporters, the elite, have been doing very nicely, thank you, Russia has been gripped by systemic corruption. This is not a new problem. The US Treasury estimate that about 20% of Russian GDP is affected by corruption each year. It is huge. The other thing to note here is that support among young Russians for imprisoned opposition leader and anti-corruption campaigner Alexei Navalny remains quite resilient. Although one thing that's happened since Russia launched the full-scale invasion from the 24th of February of this year, that 200,000 Russians, many of whom are critical of the Putin regime, have left the country, which is quite a sizable number to leave within 1 month. The other thing to notice here, which we shouldn't lose sight of, is while there is increasing strains on the Putin leadership, the failure to deal with the problem that many Russians are not doing well economically under Mr. Putin, that many Russians, particularly young Russians who get their news from sources other than the state media, are quite frustrated, particularly frustrated that an anti-corruption campaigner like Mr. Navalny wasn't allowed to run in the 2018 election and remains imprisoned. Indeed, he's received another 9 years on his sentence while the world has been distracted by the Ukraine crisis. There's another thing here that also worries the Kremlin, and that is it has been rattled by large-scale protests against Mr. Putin's authoritarian allies in Belarus and Kazakhstan. Many of you will recall there have been discontent in those countries, and Mr. Putin basically intervened to support the two authoritarian leaders in question. In these circumstances, the Putin regime has been deeply concerned about the political efforts that are about the political effects that a closer relationship between a democratic and Western-orientated Ukraine would have in Russia itself over time. Basically, the last thing Mr. Putin wants is a vibrant democracy in a substantial country like Ukraine. Because of the historic and cultural links between the two countries, and given the fact that already many young people are disenchanted with the Putin regime in Russia, the regime probably quite accurately calculates it could be a democracy in Ukraine, a resilient and vibrant democracy, could destabilize the authoritarian rule of Mr. Putin's government. Thus, Mr. Putin's invasion of the Ukraine does reflect a sense of threat in the Kremlin, but it's a threat relating to the political survival of his 22-year-old authoritarian regime rather than the national security of Russia as the regime has claimed. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Patman, my first question was a corker until you answered it, that very last comment, which is a really interesting one in terms of why would the people of Russia really worry about what's going on in the Ukraine, from the sense of why would a war in Ukraine, an invasion of Ukraine, and sort of military success really empower and strengthen Putin's leadership and rule over Russia? But it really comes down to that fact that it's not because war's popular or anything for the Russian people. It's more the alternative of a bustling, democratic, open, free country could really be the Berlin Wall moment for Russia, if you will, in terms of people going, hang on, there's an alternative out there, and the alternative looks better than Putin's 22-year rule.
Yes, politics is often a choice between difficult alternatives. And the other thing here was, I think, James, is that I think Mr. Putin believes that he could use. He's invested heavily in the military sector in Russia to modernize it, particularly since 2010. And I think he probably calculated that a rapid blitzkrieg could overthrow, if you like, decapitate the Zelensky government and be in Kyiv within a matter of days. In other words, that the Ukrainians would not show the sort of resistance. Indeed, it's been said by people within Russia that the Kremlin expected Russian troops to be greeted as liberators. There is a danger when you keep pumping out propaganda that some of the top leaders actually believe it. But yeah, I mean, I think Mr. Putin, he's clearly sensitive to protests. I mean, everybody who tries to protest in Russia, more than 6,000 people have been, that's probably a conservative estimate, have been detained since the war. There have been protests across 44 cities, relatively small numbers, because attempts at protest are very robustly dealt with. People are jailed, and in Russia at the moment, you can be jailed for up to 15 years for talking about an invasion or even a war in Ukraine. So this is the regime insists in a sort of Orwellian fashion that this is just a special military operation. But I think, to come back to your question, from Putin's point of view, the risks were worth taking. And he you know, in a sense, he's misread the situation. It's quite clear. This is a colossal strategic error, monumental. And ironically, he's probably put more pressure on his regime by intervening than by not intervening. But from his point of view, the increasing westward orientation of Ukraine and its links and its utter determination to deepen those links, from his point of view, was a threat to his regime.
Does that mean, though, that the end game for this is a lot more protracted, a lot more bloody, and things aren't going to end in some diplomatic ceasefire in the next couple of weeks? Because if his worry really is around his rule of Russia and Eastern Europe, and the nervousness around a democratic Ukraine, there's a lot of talk over the weekend about how they're sort of more focused on some of those regions that they essentially already occupy, in the Donbass region, etc. Does that mean actually this is all for show, and the likelihood is he will want to continue the effort until his objectives are met?
I think he will try to continue as long as he can. I think he first of all lacks the economic capability for a sustained military effort. Ukraine is what Afghanistan was for the Soviet Union, but he's already taken horrendous costs. NATO estimates, and the Ukrainian government estimate, that between 12 and 15,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, let alone the casualties, the injuries, and those taken prisoner. They've lost quite a lot. So in the space of 1 month, Mr. Putin has lost more troops in Ukraine than the Soviet Union lost in 8 years in Afghanistan. In addition, between 10 and 15% of Russian military armor has been immobilized. And it's all very well saying you're going to carry on to achieve your objectives, but A, that needs considerable military capability to do that, and B, you need the support of your own military. 6 Russian generals were killed, in fact 7 now, out of 20, and the war's only been going a month. A number have been detained, sacked, and Mr. Putin is unhappy with the performance of the FSB, which he'd previously been director of, the Russian intelligence service. The person responsible, the foreign arm of the Russian intelligence service, the director, has been put under house arrest, and his deputy director has also been put under house arrest. And there are real signs of discontent within the FSB, because it would appear that Mr. Putin made this decision largely alone, and the military had already warned Mr. Putin before the invasion that it would be a catastrophe. When I say the military, there were senior elements in the Russian military that made such a warning. Now, whether they were representative of the whole Russian military is a different matter, but it's striking that there were such warnings. Why do I mention this? Because it comes back to your question. He would like to go as long as possible and achieve his objectives, but he may have to go to a plan B, which may be a focus more on eastern Ukraine. But the momentum is definitely now with Ukraine in terms of the combat.
Because on that basis, do the Russians even have enough reserves to replace and reinforce the scale of military involvement that they're currently undertaking? So
that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it would seem that they've been bringing up reserves from relatively remote parts of Russia to plug the gaps. But the demoralization within the Russian forces is profound. They have not been getting adequate food. The Ukrainians have noticed that many Russian troops have spent a lot of their time badgering them for food and scavenging for food. And some of the food they had was past its sell-by date. You see, the military has been affected by the corruption that's affected the rest of Russian society. No sector is untouched when you have a regime which is essentially a kleptocratic regime. So, yeah, I mean, these are major problems. It seems to me that Mr. Putin has attempted to go for broke, but he has serious problems whether he can actually do that. And if anything, Ukraine's going to get stronger in the having survived, to use a boxing analogy, having survived first round knockout and got through to fight some more rounds, the middleweight may actually start to sap the heavyweight. And I think that's what we're seeing. And the Ukrainians have shown themselves to be extremely competent at deploying technology they're receiving. Capabilities like the Javelin missile, the Stinger missile have been devastating for Russian armor. And they are crying out for fighter aircraft. They have got some, but they haven't got enough from their point of view. And I think the other thing is that it's very difficult to see how a diplomatic settlement can easily be fashioned, because the Ukrainians are united in resisting Russian domination, and they will not want to see their country divided in two, which is, maybe Mr. Putin's plan B. So I'm not sure how there's going to be a diplomatic solution. And I think to some extent, Mr. Biden's rather careless remark at the weekend about, this Mr. Putin should not be allowed to remain in power reflects the fact that he has not been responsive to diplomatic efforts, and he's behaving in a way, his regime is behaving in a way in launching attacks, missile attacks and shelling attacks on urban centres where civilians are heavily concentrated. Most people will classify that as a war crime.
Let's touch on that, if you will, in terms of, we've talked about Putin's aims, and Ukraine's aims and Zelensky's aims are obviously pretty obvious in terms of what they're trying to get out of it. They want to remain in control of their country and be a sort of a democratic unto themselves. But what about the West? What about Biden? Was that mistake, as one of our attendees or listeners have said, was that a sort of a carefully crafted mistake of words, or is it a frustration that Biden has in terms of saying that there needs to be some sort of regime change, or what's?
Well, I would agree with your questioner. I think there may have been some frustration there because he came against a backdrop in which he described a situation with some emotion about the appalling brutality of the Russian military in the Ukraine. But I think it was also a warning. You know, there has been a sense that everyone's been tiptoeing around the Putin regime, and it has not observed many restraints in its own behavior in the Ukraine. And everyone's worried, about, if we protect Ukrainian civilians, it could result in a third world war. If we try and impose a no-fly zone, it could result in a third world war. I think Biden was signaling to the Kremlin that he knows that the Kremlin's at war with the West generally, and this is not just about Ukraine, and that the NATO and the democratic countries in the world are united in resisting the Kremlin. And I think there's a message there that maybe if you want to stay in power, the best thing to do is withdraw your troops from Ukraine. The assumption for Mr. Putin is that he would deepen his hold on power by subjugating, annexing Ukraine. And then, of course, and this is why the Eastern European countries are so very much behind Ukraine, is because they believe that they will be the next target. And so I do think, what one of your questions suggested, a carefully crafted. I think there was, a message there to the Kremlin. And remember, Biden has got a range of intelligence that none of us have access to. And they are picking up on discontent within Putin's power base. That may have been an attempt by suggesting that Putin was effectively an illegitimate leader. That may have been an attempt to encourage those discontented voices within both the Russian military and also within the FSB, which had previously been Putin's power base, but we now understand is extremely unhappy with the way things have panned out in the Ukraine. They feel they've been bypassed and then blamed.
On NATO then, what obviously part of Putin's plan was to sort of destabilize NATO. It's for all of Europe's woes, it seems to have made it a lot stronger. Does that mean it actually gets bigger and countries like Sweden and Finland join? You have more Eastern European countries perhaps admitted, and that's going to, if Putin is still in power, which let's assume he is for the foreseeable, really start to heighten hostilities and perhaps cause more tension in the area, not just what's going on in Ukraine?
It depends on the outcome in the Ukraine. If Mr. Putin is if he is militarily defeated, the Ukrainians are talking about winning the war against Putin's army. Winning the war means ejecting Russian troops from Ukraine. If that happens, then it will be difficult, I think, for Mr. Putin to sell that as a win.
Do you think that's possible? Do you think that, as an aside, do you think that's actually possible, that Ukraine could win this war?
Well, Ukraine has got much more international support than Russia has, and is fighting much more effectively. If I was Mr. Putin, I'd be extremely concerned about the present situation. And not only that, the Ukrainians are taking Russian prisoners in the areas which are part of Plan B, such as Luhansk. They took 100 prisoners over the weekend. Russian prisoners, soldiers, some of whom haven't been fed for days. Mr. Putin hasn't been looking after his army well enough. And, we are only 1 month into this conflict, And one thing we do know about conflicts, they can be notoriously unpredictable. Wars are often the one thing you can predict about wars is they very rarely go according to plan. And if you look at the experience of the post-Cold War era, this interconnected world we now live in, the track record of great powers being able to get their way, or countries which aspire to be great powers getting their way, is not impressive. The United States, the most powerful country in the world, was not able to invade Iraq and successfully occupy the country. By 2010, it had to basically leave with the tail between its legs. And that was an illegal war, and it didn't work. What it led to was a full-blown insurgency, which strengthened the forces of extremism in the Middle East, that didn't weaken it. And then you look at China. China has got a 90% claim on the South China Sea. China may feel good about making that claim, but what have they done in the region? They've basically pushed Japan and South Korea into the arms of the Americans. And you could say, even as we've seen, in the Russian case, they annexed Crimea, which gave Mr. Putin a short-term nationalist boost. But it nearly broke his economy. For 2 years, the Russian economy didn't grow because of the sanctions which flowed from the annexation of Crimea. In fact, it contracted by 2.3% in 2015, the Russian economy. Now, you may say, oh, he'll be indifferent to that because, he won't feel the pain. He and his cohort won't feel the pain. Maybe that's true. But this most recent set of sanctions, I think, will inflict much more pain. The point I'm trying to make here is I think the days in which great powers can unilaterally act and achieve all their objectives are over. Many of the problems states face now are too big for even superpowers. Climate change, COVID-19, transnational terrorism, problems of the global economy. And in a sense, Mr. Putin still has this belief, perhaps because he's living in an information bubble, that if Russia shows enough political will and brutal force, it can prevail in the Ukraine. I'm skeptical.
Do you have comments on on China's view of all this? They obviously have to be very careful in how they comment on things, but they're going to be very heightened in terms of things like what's going on in the South China Sea and with Hong Kong, and they also have, I guess, a reliance on Russia in terms of oil and gas. So, where do they sit in this whole conflict?
Well, first of all, China doesn't regard Russia as an equal. It's a junior partner as far as China is concerned. They are very conscious of the pecking order. And the other thing is, let's be quite clear, China's rise to superpower status is based on access to the world capitalist market. Essentially, the Chinese leadership in the last 4 decades has had an informal deal with the Chinese people, which is as follows. The Chinese Communist Party says, let us exercise a monopoly of political power and we will deliver consistently economic growth. And it's worked. More than 500 million Chinese have been lifted out of poverty, which is a historic achievement by any stretch. But China will calibrate its support for Russia in a way that doesn't endanger what's made China strong, which is access to the US market, to the EU market, the most prosperous single market in the world, and also Japan. And I think, yes, they do share objectives with Russia. They both want what they call a multipolar world, which is basically code for a world in which America is not the sole superpower. America has to share powers or share power with other leading contenders in the world. But I would be very surprised if China goes too far in its support. There's already signs that it's rowing back. on its support for Russia. At the beginning of this crisis, many people thought that that China was going to completely throw its support behind Russia. But I think China is smart enough to realise that could mean that it would be the subject of extended sanctions as well. So my own view is that I think China will be very measured. It will give Russia symbolic support, but it will be very anxious not to do anything to undermine its economy in the process, because the political legitimacy of the ruling party in China depends on economic achievement. And by the way, that economic achievement depends on access to the world capitalist global economy.
Professor, I'm wondering if the last 10 minutes we could get a bit of, for want of a better phrase, get a crystal ball out and have a think about what could happen. And there's a few key things that, again, when you read headlines and through the main press around, there's nuclear threats, will Putin ever want to walk away without some sort of victory because of what you've been setting out? Are the sanctions really working? Does the military have the capability? There's a lot of pressure on getting some sort of outcome soon. At the same time, you've had other commentators, more military commentators, so retired generals, etc., saying, hang on, everyone, this has been a month. War takes time. Russia's made pretty decent progress in quite a large country. I think that's probably stretching it slightly, but has a lot of capabilities. Some of it abhorrent in terms of chemical weapons and things. That this is going to take a long time to play out, and don't dismiss Putin yet. How do you see things playing out at this juncture? And I know it's things change every day, but do you sort of have a sense of what you think is perhaps in military terms, the most likely course of action?
Well, I've gone in print saying this, but I've taken the view that Mr. Putin made a colossal strategic error, which will have dire consequences for him politically downstream. Even if Mr. Putin succeeds in grabbing part of the Ukraine, overrunning part of it, or even all of it, he will not have the military capability to hold it. He hasn't got the economic strength. He would need an army of administrators. And how is he going to put in pro-Russian regimes, either in eastern Ukraine or in full Ukraine? If he, let's just say, hypothetically, he took over Kyiv. As you mentioned, Ukraine's a big country. How is he going to run a country as big as Ukraine economically, and also politically? The Ukrainians are absolutely adamant they are not going to be run by the Kremlin. And that's one thing that's really united the Ukrainians. They're very united. The Russians are divided. And so let's go for the optimistic scenario from the Kremlin. Let's say he's militarily successful, that he can overrun either eastern part of Ukraine or the whole of Ukraine. But then he has a major problem, as we saw with the Americans in Iraq, overthrowing a government, taking over the capital is not the trick. The trick is to put in place a political system, a pro-Russian regime in the case of Ukraine, that is accepted by the population as a whole. No, that's not going to happen. So it seems to me that Mr. Putin, what we're talking about is the degree of defeat for Mr. Putin. And that's, to me, it's a negative outcome for the authoritarian regime in Moscow. The scenario I just painted for you, in which Russia succeeded militarily in the short term, would condemn Moscow to an insurgency in the Ukraine. It would make, if you thought Afghanistan was a nightmare for the Soviets, and it was certainly a nightmare for the Americans when they were there, Ukraine would make that insurgency look like a tea party. And because they're getting a lot of support internationally, and they will get support internationally if Mr. Putin's brutal tactics, these missile strikes, if they wore down the Ukrainians in the short term, it wouldn't necessarily change things in the long term. So I think we're now looking at what sort of a scenario. Zelensky has indicated he's amenable to Ukraine not having membership of NATO, but he said he wants to join the EU. That wouldn't be acceptable to the Kremlin. I'm finding it very difficult to come up with a scenario which Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Putin will both agree to. Too much blood has been spilt. Over 1,000 civilians killed by the Russians in the last month alone. Many young children, women, and civilians generally. If you put yourself in Ukrainian shoes, they are utterly determined not to allow Mr. Putin to extract a diplomatic victory from this. So I think what's going to happen, very difficult to predict. We could be in for a protracted conflict. I personally don't think that's going to happen because I don't think Russia's got the economic capability. And so I think we cannot rule out the possibility of Russia, Mr. Putin having to eat humble pie and retreating, pulling his troops out. In return, Mr. Zelensky gives an undertaking that Ukraine won't join NATO. But that won't, let's be quite clear, that might fix Mr. Putin's problem in the short term, but that will be unacceptable in Moscow. The people supporting Mr. Putin, if you look at Russian state TV, they think they have the right to dictate things in Ukraine. And if Mr. Putin's special military operation doesn't achieve that, there's going to be a real backlash against Putin.
Professor Patman, that is a troubling way to end a really interesting hour. Only troubling because feels like there is really no way out other than for this conflict to continue for the foreseeable until and it's waiting for cooler heads to prevail of someone that doesn't really have a cooler head.
James, my crystal ball is no better than anyone else's, and I'm just giving you the sense I have. And as I say, war is a surprising thing. It sometimes throws up scenarios that none of us could have imagined. So we have to be, a bit modest about this.
As someone that has been to staff college in Waiouru, no plan lasts to H hour, and I think that's the main thing I learned from that, and I think that's true. You can think about all the different courses of action and what's going to happen, but in reality, it's probably going to be something slightly different to what we've been discussing. But
yeah.
I think what it does tell us all, though, is that this has got a long time to play out, and there's going to be, unfortunately, a whole lot more bloodshed until it does, and that's a real tragic thing for the people of Ukraine and just humanity in general. But hopefully, we can get some sort of, cooler heads at some point, and at least have a little bit of calmness and diplomacy. But we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, very true.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and would love to have you back on in the not too distant future, so to give us an update of how you think things are evolving. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, James. Pleasure. Bye for now.
And we're right on the hour, so we will leave it there, everyone. Thank you so much for all your questions. There were a lot of questions, probably the most questions we've had on this in the last 2 years. So thank you very much for sending those through. This will be put up onto our Spotify and Apple podcast site, the Monday Call. So if you do want to re-listen to it or send it along to your clients or friends or family, do feel free to share, and be more than grateful for you to go on and share this around. And again, thank you for the questions. Have a great rest of your week.